A 13-year-old black boy, often lost in thought during class, is suddenly called upon by his teacher. He's forced to stand and face a math equation far beyond his grade level. His classmates, some chuckling, others doubtful, watch with skepticism. But what they don't realize is that the boy standing before the board is a hidden math prodigy. The midday sun cast warm streaks of light across the polished floors of Riverside Middle School. It was early autumn in Atlanta, Georgia, and the classrooms hummed with the quiet buzz of students chatting, chairs scraping, and paper shuffling. Room 3002 was no different. The space was filled with the restless energy of 8th graders settling in for math class. Near the back, close to the window, Jamal Carter, a quiet, 13-year-old black boy, took his usual seat. His presence was subtle, making it easy for him to blend into the background. His sharp brown eyes, though often distant, wandered beyond the window, more captivated by the outside world than the classroom itself. As he placed his notebook on the desk, his posture was relaxed, almost too much so, one arm resting lazily on the table while the other propped up his chin. Beyond the window, trees swayed gently, and a bird hopped along the fence. The outside world seemed far more interesting than the noisy room around him. But Jamal wasn't inattentive by choice. His mind worked faster than the class pace, and while numbers and equations fascinated him, the slow, repetitive nature of the lessons felt uninspiring. Instead of raising his hand or engaging, he let his thoughts drift, finding comfort in the rhythm of the world beyond the glass. His notebook, though mostly empty on assigned pages, held something special. Margins filled with advanced equations and solutions he had challenged himself to solve in his free time. At the front of the room, Mrs. Amanda Thompson stood, arms crossed, her sharp gaze sweeping over the students as they settled in. A no-nonsense teacher with years of experience, Mrs. Thompson was known for her strict approach and high expectations. Her neatly styled hair and tailored blazer only added to her commanding presence. She prided herself on identifying potential in her students and pushing them when she felt they weren't meeting it. But today, her patience was wearing thin. The latest math test results sat in a neat stack on her desk, and while a few students had done well, most had struggled. She didn't tolerate mediocrity, and the sight of so many low scores left her questioning whether her students were even trying. She picked up the papers and began handing them back, offering brief remarks, "Decent work," to some, and "You need to study more," to others. When she reached Jamal's desk, she paused for a moment. His test sat at the top of the stack, a bold red 100% circled at the top. It wasn't the first time he'd aced a test, but his lack of participation in class frustrated her. Without a word, she placed the paper on his desk, her lips pressing into a thin line as she moved on. "All right, listen up." Her voice sliced through the classroom noise, instantly silencing the chatter. She leaned against her desk, her sharp eyes scanning the students. "Most of you did okay," she began, though her tone suggested otherwise. "But a lot of you are still struggling with concepts we've been covering for weeks." Jamal barely paid attention. Chin resting on his hand, his eyes drifted back toward the window. The rustling leaves outside were far more interesting than another one of Mrs. Thompson's lectures. But what he didn't notice was her gaze flickering in his direction. "This is basic algebra," she continued, her voice rising. "You'll need to understand this if you want to succeed in high school, in college, in life." Her eyes locked onto Jamal's distant expression, irritation flashing across her face. "Jamal Carter," she snapped. Jamal flinched, his hand slipping from his chin as every head in the room turned toward him. His heart pounded. Heat rushed to his face. "Why, yes, ma'am," he mumbled, barely audible. Mrs. Thompson's eyes narrowed. "You seem very interested in something outside that window," she said, nodding toward it. "Care to share what's so fascinating?" A few students chuckled under their breath. Jamal hesitated, opening his mouth but quickly shutting it, unsure of how to respond. Mrs. Thompson wasn't amused. "Let's see if you've been paying attention," she said sharply. "Come up here." The room fell silent. Jamal's chair scraped against the floor as he stood slowly. Eyes followed him, some filled with amusement, others with curiosity. "She's gonna roast him," a voice muttered. He never talks. Bet he doesn't even know what's going on, another student whispered, stifling a laugh. Jamal swallowed hard. His palms were sweaty as he walked to the front. Every step made the whiteboard seem impossibly far away. Mrs. Thompson stood beside the board, marker in hand. Her expression was unreadable. With deliberate strokes, she wrote a complex equation, far beyond what they had covered. Then, she turned to Jamal, holding out the marker. "Go ahead," she said, almost challenging. "Show us what you've got." The marker felt cold in his fingers. He stared at the equation, his mind racing. Whispers and quiet snickers filled the room. Pressure. His heart pounded. For a brief moment, he considered handing the marker back, walking away. But then something stopped him. A voice inside reminded him of the countless hours he had spent solving problems like this. This wasn't about Mrs. Thompson or his classmates. It was about him. Jamal took a deep breath, and he began to write. At first, his strokes were slow, cautious. But as he moved from one step to the next, his hand grew steadier. The classroom's whispers faded. Some students had expected him to freeze. Instead, they watched in shock as he started solving it. "Wait, is he actually doing it?" a girl whispered. "Looks like it," her friend replied, leaning forward. Jamal's mind worked quickly, breaking the equation down, simplifying variables, eliminating unnecessary steps. His hand moved faster now. The squeak of the marker against the board filled the silence. He wasn't just solving the problem.
He was dismantling it.
The room grew still. The students who had laughed were now watching, eyes wide, mouths slightly open. Even Mrs. Thompson stepped closer, scanning each line of his work. Jamal paused, double-checking his steps. Then, he wrote the final answer, circled it, and clicked the marker shut. Silence. For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the low hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Then applause. Soft at first, then growing louder. Jamal turned, heart still racing, to see his classmates staring at him, not with mockery, but with respect. Mrs. Thompson stepped forward, tracing each step of his solution with her fingers. Then finally she spoke. "This is correct." The class erupted. Jamal stood there, unsure of how to react. His cheeks burned, but for the first time, it wasn't from embarrassment. It was from pride. And for the first time, he realized maybe it was time to stop hiding. Maybe he was meant to be seen.